Bill Ayers, it's Gerry Fialka on January 18th, 2013. Thank you so much for your time and energy.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
The best thing for a human being is to live a life of balance and to dive into the contradictions of life and swim as hard as you can against the current and see where it takes you.
That is great. Are you a swimmer?
I am. I swim, but I'm also an old man now, so I don't swim like I once did. But yeah, I love diving into a river or into a waterfall or into Venice Beach and just seeing where it takes me. Yeah. But I think of it that way. It's more of a metaphor, but I think that a lot of people want to live a life that's not filled with contradiction. That's impossible.
Yeah.
Life is contradiction. Yeah. And in reality, contradiction may yet save us. And that's the funny thing. It always feels like I want to resolve this contradiction, but that's not the trick. The trick is to live within contradiction and to live fully within contradiction.
Well put. In answering that question, I added it in 30 years of these questions. I added that about 5 years ago. And I've come to the conclusion, what's the best thing for a human being? Conflict or contradiction.
Exactly.
And McLuhan nailed it. He says, if it works, it's obsolete.
Exactly. And the things we know, that's so true of education, which is my world, that when you teach the things we already know, there isn't anything more boring, disconnecting, alienating for young people than to be taught what we already have established. Yeah. It's not only boring, it's irrelevant. Yeah. That's why watching a baby is so marvelous. I have 3 little grandchildren, and they're discovering all the time, and they're not satisfied with the given, the taken for granted. Everything has to be new, has to be discovered, has to be put in your mouth. It's good advice for all of us.
Very good.
Put it in your mouth.
Bill, what is your favorite form of information?
I think my favorite form of information is probably poetry, because poetry and imaginative arts of all kinds. Because what poetry does is decenters us, and it doesn't pretend to have the answers. In fact, I often think it's the artists who really bring us the news, not the news. The news brings us the lies, it brings us the taken for granted, brings us a frame that's irrelevant or destructive. So I was in line this morning for coffee, and there was a young man looking at the New York Times. I said, "Are you going to buy that?" And he said, "No, never." And I said, "Good for you. I need one because I'm addicted to it. But I know that not only is the content toxic, but I'm killing these trees." He said, "If I need anything from the New York Times, I'll get it online, but I don't need anything from the New York Times." I said, "Exactly." So,
oh no!
And my kids, I'll tell you, I have 3 kids, all of whom do live theater. My eldest is a playwright and a screenwriter. My second kid is a middle school math teacher, and my third is a public defender in San Francisco. And I say they all do live theater. That is, they're in front of an audience doing something, and they say to me consistently, my oldest son, who's an artist, says to me, "I've watched you for a while, and you waste at least 2 hours a day with things like NPR and the New York Times." And I say, "You're patronizing me." And he says, "Exactly." But he said, "You would learn so much more if you read a novel or a book of poetry. You would know more at the end of the day." And he said, and I said, "Yeah, but I want to be informed." And he says, "Tell me something you know that I don't know." I say, "Well, Lance Armstrong is going to confess to lying." He said, "I know that. And I didn't read the New York Times or listen to NPR," right? So the information that we get superficially is all around us. The trick is to go beyond and to go deeper. So that's why I say artists are the true purveyors of news. You can learn more from Charles Dickens about what's going on in this country today than from NPR.
Yeah. You anticipated one question really well, but we're not going to get to that yet, because the next question is, why do humans collect or gather information?
I think that we are, intrepid gatherers of information of all kinds. And one of the things, when you say it that way, I mean, immediately our minds click to the kind of information one gets from the New York Times or the television. But the kind of information we're gathering all the time with all 5 of our senses is information about what it means to be rolling along in this wild and unruly society. And the problem with the official information is it tries to sand off the rough edges and give it to us in a narrative that's palatable. And that's what we don't need. What we need, I often think that what we need, all of us, is we need to vow that every day we'll do some anarchist calisthenics to stay in shape, so that when it comes time to break the big rules, we're ready. And I think too much of the time, too many of us are either put to sleep or mesmerized or hypnotized into thinking there is a linear story of our lives, and it's all neatonized for us. You can see it, you may not be old enough, but you can see it in the aftermath of 9/11. It was chaos for about 2 months, and the official voices were hammering, this is what happened. Yeah. This is what it meant. This is how to understand it. This is the only true way to understand it. And people like Edward Said and Susan Sontag and Bill Maher and Aaron Magruder were being pummeled because they weren't buying the official line within months. And there was an uncharacteristic openness in American people everywhere. What happened? Why did it happen? How should we rethink who we are in the world? Great. Let's do that. But no, the strong voices, the official voices, got in line, saluted, and then hammered us. The interesting thing is, it only works to an extent. If you go deeper, I mean, it's still true that most people are very skeptical of the official outlets and so on. Anyway, that was
good. No, now the next question in that information through line is this need or want to collect information hardwired, or do we learn it?
I think it's hardwired. I look at my grandchildren. They want information. They want to make sense of the world. Yeah. And the fascinating thing, I'm watching my 5-month-old beginning to crawl. And I've seen all kind of crawlers in my life. I used to be an early childhood infant toddler daycare center worker. I've seen kids who crawled like the wounded veteran, and I've seen kids who scoot, and I've seen kids who, go backwards. But my little grandson right now, he's doing what we're calling the inchworm. He'll get up on his elbows, and then he can't figure out how to move, so he'll put his head down and his butt up, and then he'll inchworm forward. Now, is that hardwired? Nobody's giving him a reward for that. Nobody's breaking down the steps of how to crawl and saying, if you do step 1, you can move on to step 2. If you get a B- in step 1, you're going to have to repeat the class. Nobody's saying that to him. And the same with talking. Yeah. So he's only 5 months old, but he's going, rah, 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 and his parents will answer, rah, rah, rah. And suddenly he's in dialogue. Yeah. And here's the other way to think about it, Gerry. I watched this baby be born, and within 5 minutes he was on his mother's breast. And the question you have to ask yourself is, who was teaching whom how to nurse? The mama had read the books, so she had some information. Right. But the baby had other information at 5 minutes old. If he at 5 minutes he's teaching his mother how to nurse him, what is it like at 5 years or 15 years or 55 years? Or, I mean, the idea that human beings need external rewards and punishments to gather the information they need to survive is wrong. And a lot of the kind of misdirection that we go into with life in general is based on this false premise. Yeah. Left to ourselves, with each other, we can run our own affairs, we can manage what we need. Give you one other quick example of that if you're interested. But that is that we had a mayoral election recently in Chicago, and all the progressives had many, many meetings trying to figure out who could we put up against Rahm Emanuel. And every meeting, and of course he had the money, he had money from Hollywood, he had money from the Obama network, he had money from Israel, and he didn't campaign. He just did TV ads, and he won, of course. The progressives had 11 candidates, and they couldn't decide on one. But every meeting I went to, I said, why do we need a mayor? And everybody would hoot me. Everybody would say, you're being silly. Of course we need a mayor. And I would say, why do we need a mayor? Right. Well, I said, what does the mayor do? Well, no, seriously, what does the mayor do? And the response was, makes a budget, I don't know, cuts ribbons. Nobody knows what the mayor does. Right. And the truth is, I'm a huge believer in a simple theme, which is every cook can govern. Every bartender can govern. Every student can govern. And the idea that we need a mayor to tell us where to stand in line is nonsense. We don't need a mayor. We need to have confidence in ourselves. And I think we're intrepid information gatherers in the broadest sense.
Yeah.
5 senses working overtime in community to figure out where we're
Beautiful. What's the roots of that? Because you've said that in the past. You made that word up, that line up, or is it
Which
rooted
line?
in somebody? Every cook can govern.
Every Cook Can Govern
Is
is the title of a paper by C.L.R. James, who was the great Caribbean revolutionary. And C.L.R. James wrote an essay. He was a combination of an activist, revolutionary, political actor, but also a man of the humanities, creative man, just an all-around.
What year is he saying that about? Or writing that essay about?
Okay, he wrote the essay probably in the 30s or 40s.
Yeah.
But the essay is a scholarly essay, and what it's about is the 150 years of radical Greek democracy in the whole Greek period. There were 150 years that are called the radical experiment. And what they did is they made all decisions in the forum. And when they had to have a job done, like say we need a commissioner of sanitation, they would draw names out of a hat. You could be the commissioner of sanitation. Why do you need to be a professional? And what it breaks down, and what James is talking about, is the idea that the way we're going to make life better is we'll have a professional class. We'll professionalize our problems. So now we have not just a teacher and a social worker and a government class, but we also have experts on population, experts on plumbing, experts on, and the experts, we give ourselves over to the experts. That's not to say there isn't expertise that the community needs. But as soon as you say an expert class can make decisions about what to do with nuclear waste, for example, because what do I know? I don't know anything. That is where we fall apart. We have to believe that we are the sovereign, that we, the people, are the ones who can govern ourselves, and left to ourselves, we'll come up with better answers. Quick example from Los Angeles. I've been roaming around Los Angeles the last few days, and if I want to go from point A to point B, and I enter it into the web, and it's 17 miles, it's going to take me an hour. And I'm like, really? This is the best we can do? And what I'm thinking is, if the three of us were sitting, or the folks who are listening to this, we were sitting around in a room, and we said, transportation, getting from place to place, is a valuable thing.
Yeah.
How should we do it? And we don't start with highways and cars and private industry and tires. And if we didn't start there, what might we come up with? And that's the kind of thinking that I think we need to do if we're going to find a way out of the morass we're trapped in, because they've given us all the parameters. You have to have a highway system. You have to have, you have to have a private car that you drive in. Why? Why is that the optimal solution to the question?
That's a beautiful statement, because it'll lead in this. This is off of the program, but real general, Marx said, the point of the world is not to interpret it, but to change it. So simplifying it, McLuhan said, you've got high aspirations, Carl, but you can't change diddly squat because your tools change you. Now that he knows that their tools are extensions of every humanness. So he knows that's called, he's not truly a technological determinist, but that's what he gets labeled in Wikipedia. So he said, Hitler didn't cause World War II, the radio caused it. Some of my political researchers friends say, oh no, Hitler caused it, and he used the radio. And Marshall's saying, no, we don't really understand the impact of that tool. Just in general, what's your opinion of those two sort of contradictory, even though they're simplified?
Well, it's somewhat simplified, but I think that I've always admired Marx's line that the philosophers pointed, the highest level of philosophy is not to interpret the world, but to change it. And I think that what that urges on me is to get off of my couch and to do something. That my, I have a great impatience with folks who think that being a cynical observer of the world from, underneath your hookah sitting on your couch is good enough. No, your morality only is real when it's expressed in in the public square somewhere. So I like that. But where I think McLuhan is absolutely right is that, you know, the tools change us. We see things differently. And again, you can see it in the growth of in your own growth as well as the growth of a child. When you're crawling, your world looks, you know, the horizon of your imagination is so much. When you get up on your hind legs, it expands. When you get your first driver's license, the thing that blows the mind of every 16-year-old who gets a driver's license is they didn't know where they were in the world until they could drive. Now they suddenly know that you have to take a left turn on Venice Boulevard. Right. They didn't know that before. They knew that they were taken places, but right. And then it expands from there. I think all that's true. The other thing I think is true is that not just the tools, but the positions we occupy change us more than we change them. So one of the great myths that young people bring to the project of social change is that my good intentions will be enough once I occupy this position to move the world in my direction. And it's never true. So whatever people think about President Obama, the fact is that being the president changed him. Now, some folks would say, my own view of that is that he is very coherent and consistent with who he's always been. He always said when he was attacked by the right, I'm a moderate, middle-of-the-road, compromising, pragmatic, New Democrat kind of person. And the right looked at him and said, no, he's a secret socialist, secret terrorist, right. Pals around with these guys, and is a secret black nationalist with a prayer group in Hyde right. Park. And the left looked at him and said, I feel him winking at me. But he was telling the truth. He was who he was. But more than that, then with whatever good intentions he brought to the office, being president means you sit in the chair of empire. You are in charge of the American empire. And that changes you. Yeah. Whoever you think you are, your field of operation becomes, and you begin to rationalize it in your own mind. So the idea that you can be a free agent changing things is not true. Tools are very much like that. So yeah. Before, when you look at some of the great thinkers of the turn of the last century, John Dewey, to take an example, he was a great believer in science. In fact, all the Darwin, Freud, Marx, Dewey, they all believed in science. Now, we become skeptical of science because they were writing before the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. Now, suddenly, science is linked to technology. Suddenly, we don't have the same romantic view. What they were seeing was that science could defeat medieval feudal thinking. Superstition could be defeated by science. But now we look at it and we say science of that type can be the great monster that turns us all into monsters. Yeah. And we see it increasingly in our world today. So that we don't. So now we have this kind of postmodern reality. Drones. Yeah. That's war without blood. Coffee without caffeine. Butter without fat, sex without a partner. I mean, it's an endless series right. of very possibilities, which has alienated us from our very core humanity. And that's one of the things that I think is...
That was so well put. Blake said, you become what you behold. Absolutely. And Mark Twain said, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Absolutely.
So in regards to the tools, Marshall said that everything we invent extends some humanness. So knife and fork extends our teeth. Yeah. Clothing extends our skin. Yeah. What does the writing utensil extend for you? That is, whether it's a pencil or a keyboard.
I think the writing utensil, I think that one of the great things about writing or the paintbrush or, the knife, the sculpting tools, I think what it does is it allows us to make a footprint in the sand, to extend our thinking into the world and to find and to enter into a dialogue. One of the things I learned when I was quite old, I was 45 years old when I published my first book. And one of the things that thrilled me about holding it in my hand was the idea that, here's something that I can drop into the pool and the water will eddy out. And when I got my first response, I thought my mind would just blown because I was now in dialogue with people I didn't even see, but I was in dialogue. And I still get letters from some of my early work where somebody will say, I'm a African American woman at Georgia State, and I think this comment you made on page 320, I think it's wrong. I think it's got a little edge of racism. And I write her back and I say, thank you so much. I mean, what anybody wants who throws that note in a bottle is they want somebody to respond.
Yeah.
And the more, it doesn't matter if it's cantankerous or just, if there's an authentic response coming back at you, you feel like, wow. So it extends my thinking, my imagination, my capacity to be in dialogue. That's what I like about it.
Bill, you're the best. That was very well put. You get it. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
I'm not a big believer in. I'm not a believer at all in God or religion. So I have a hard time kind of getting a hold of the notion of evil. But I do think that one of the things that I think is, we see this all the time. Today, Lance Armstrong is being pilloried for being a serial, pathological liar. And he's being held up and scorned. And everyone who's doing the scorning should hold up a mirror and ask themselves, when did you lie last? Was it 5 minutes ago or earlier this morning? Or was it yesterday? But don't give me this crap that, that person's capable, but I'm not capable. And I think that when we see the great crimes, Bosnia, Germany, the United States with slavery and with the genocide of the Native Americans, or Vietnam, when we see the great crimes, we have to remind ourselves that it's within us, that the line between good and evil runs through our heads and right through our hearts. And so it's too easy to be the self-righteous one. And the only thing, I often think this about the question of accusing others, the only time you should be absolutely certain you're wrong is when you feel that self-righteousness bubbling from within yourself. Then you're wrong. You may be right on the issue, you may be right, but that sense that I am superior, that I'm not capable of that, we're all capable. And that's what we should learn from the mass murderers. That's what we should learn from the great wars. That's, and the horror of something like Vietnam, which was such a defining moment in my life, is that to this day, the American government and the American people are in denial. So we don't want to face it. We don't want to face what we did. So now President Obama just introduced a resolution for a 10-year commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the war in Vietnam. What are we commemorating? We murdered between 3 and 4 million people. Yes, we lost 59,000 people, and that was an atrocity, and those families have suffered, and takes nothing away from that suffering to say we marched in as any arrogant occupier marches in. We decided we could destroy their crops as any arrogant colonialist. So I want to go back to the heart of darkness. I want to go back to Werner Herzog's Aguirre, The Wrath of God, where you see the colonialist. I mean, the great thing in the heart of darkness is the colonialist, the French ships. Here we are. France is bombing Mali today. And here are the French ships lying off the coast, firing randomly artillery into the jungle. Why are they doing it? It's like an assault on an entire continent. And what's great about those like Conrad or even Coppola is that they get it, that the perpetration of that kind of thing makes us, it dehumanizes the aggressor. And that's what's missing in the current crop of kind of CIA inspired art coming out of your town. This idea that somehow we're good and we're good, and because we're good, we give ourselves a pass. What any universal standard that we would apply to everybody else doesn't count for us because our intentions are good. Arrogance, evil, all of that lurks right beneath that kind of sense.
Amazing. Bill, that was super, because that leads into this. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? I'll set it up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts on this. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. That morphed into the word frenemies. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. Chinese proverb goes, he who cannot agree with their enemy is controlled by them. So there's lots of thoughts, but mainly the question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But before, could you respond directly to the first one to start off? Alan Watts, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
I mean, I think there is some truth to that, and I think it's worth noting. The problem with it, to me, is that it can also paralyze you. I don't want to be paralyzed. I want to act and doubt simultaneously. That's a very hard dialectic to live. I want to act and I want to doubt. So if I only doubt, if I only say, well, what can I do? I'm agnostic. The world is infinite and expanding. I only know a fraction of the world. Therefore, I can't really do much. I think that then paralyzes you into inaction. On the other hand, if all you do is act, and that builds up that self-righteous head of steam, then you're like, you can do no wrong. And this is very much the American experience. We're right, and therefore, okay, a few drone strikes, a few,
Right.
thousands of people. But no, that's where you go off the track decisively. So in my view, there's truth to this idea that by acknowledging your enemy, you empower them. But it's also, you have to work back from that and say, how do I act against the injustices in the world? As imperfect as I am, as limited as I am, as much as my vision is shrouded and clouded, still, how do I act and then immediately doubt?
Yeah.
And I think that's the hardest thing. So taking my own life as one example, if all you do is doubt, you're inactive. But as a weatherman, for a period of time, all we did was act. And we never rethought. So we were on the path of righteousness, and that leads to catastrophe.
Yeah.
So I think that we faced our own catastrophe and paid for it mightily. But I think that I would try to kind of find a way to move in that direction. I also think the notion "keep your friends closer, your enemies closer" is good advice. But again, even that binary, friends and enemies. I'll give you a quick example again from my own life. I mean, when I was at the University of Michigan with Rick Feldman and others, there were a lot of us who were in the student movement at that time. Some of us at Michigan in particular called ourselves the sons and daughters of the power elite. That was me, soap and dope. And then there were the sons and daughters of the labor elite. So we had Barry Bluestone, we had Eric Chester, we had Woodcock. We had all these people whose parents were, big shots in the labor movement. And we used to joke about it because we were the new left. We weren't trapped in that old thing. So I come from a family. My dad was the chairman of Commonwealth Edison. My dad was the biggest producer of nuclear power in the country next to the Tennessee Valley Authority. So were we enemies? Yes. Were we friends? Yes. And could I both love him and despise aspects of his work? And could we fight about it? And yes. So one of the things that kind of astonished people, these things always amaze me as years go by, but two things that come to my mind. One is my dad lived with Bernadine and I the last 3 years of his life. He had Alzheimer's. We took him into our home. He died in our home. Were we close? We were very close. We really loved each other. And he was very kind and generous with us, and couldn't have been, I don't think, kinder and more generous with him. But sometimes I'd come home from work, and he'd have Fox News on full volume. And I'd say, turn that crap off. And I'd turn it off, and he'd say, okay, but what do these gays want? And then I'd say, well, they don't want to marry you. And he'd say, good, I'm too old. But we, the interesting thing is, in his dementia, he also mellowed, and he never denounced me or my brother. My brother was with me all those years in the underground, and my brother was a deserter from the Army during the Vietnam period. He never denounced us. He never disowned us. He never tried to move away from that. That's a contradiction. And I think that I'm a little reluctant to say, so-and-so is an enemy. More the role is the enemy, or the policy is the enemy. Yeah. And one of the things we have to remember, again, if we want to be fully human and a little bit humble, is we have to remember that not only are we all capable, but we're all the result of many, many, many things. And our motives my motives, your motives, are also a mixture of narcissism and self-righteousness and low ambition as well as high ideals. We like to think we're powered by big high ideals and everybody else is powered by low ambition, but it's not true.
Yeah.
And even sorting out how much of did I do this because it would look good on a poster, how much did I do that because there was a young woman who I was impressing, who the hell knows. I think this is important for our own sense of sanity.
Yeah, you answered that very well. And I want to go off onto Gregory Bateson just for a second, because so if we catch whoever, Kissinger, and we say you're a war criminal and put him on court and we throw him in jail, what does that do? So Bateson says we assume the thief who is caught understands he's being punished for stealing. Yet, if no attempt is made to change his premises, it's likely that he sees himself as being punished for not stealing well.
Yeah. Lance Armstrong comes to mind. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this explains why punishment based on behavioral learning theory has so consistently failed. They do not touch the higher levels of logical typing. So in general, you get the idea. So does punishment work? And what if we do throw Kissinger in jail for a war criminal? What does that do?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's one model that we have right in front of us from the last couple of decades that is a hopeful model, even though it's an imperfect and flawed model. And that comes out of South Africa, and that is the Truth and Reconciliation process, led by Bishop Tutu and the ANC. But I don't know how well you know that process, but the process was they had a brutal regime for decades. They had a brutal oppression of an entire people. And when the ANC took power, the easy thing to do, the simple thing to do, would have been a bloodbath to just wipe them out, the people who'd been hurting you all that time. Instead, they started a process, and the process, to simplify it, involved if you come forward and tell the truth about the crimes you committed and face the people you committed those crimes against, you are going to be forgiven. You're going to be legally given amnesty for that. But you must tell the truth, and you have to tell the whole truth. And you have to face your victims. Now, this was a cathartic thing, and a lot of people had difficulty with it. Our friends in the ANC had to belly up just like everybody else and do the same thing. So one of our friends was actually charged with writing the ANC confession of their crimes. And it was, a foot thick. We, in this city, in this town, we necklaced people. We killed people. In this town, we put a bomb in a public place. In this place, we did this. And they confessed, and they were forgiven. But imagine a government in power being willing to say, we did this. Because the understanding was, even though in the great sweep of history, they were on the right side, and the apartheid regime was on the wrong side, you did bad things, even though you were on the right side. And if you don't account for those, there's no moving forward. Yeah. You get to sit in the kind of a pool of your own self-justification, and that will poison you down the road. So I think this notion of I've often thought, and I've written about this, I think that what we're missing from Vietnam is a truth and reconciliation process. Because look, how in the world could John McCain run as a war hero? He was a war criminal. He dropped bombs on civilians. In any other context, we would call that criminal behavior. And John Kerry, who got it right when he was 23 years old and said in front of the U.S. Senate, we committed war crimes every day, not as a matter of choice, but as a matter of policy. That was true. Yeah. McCain was a war criminal. John Kerry, the governor of Nebraska, who was head of the New School, admittedly slit the throats of two grandparents in a little hut outside of a village because he was afraid they were going to warn the village that they were coming. So he killed two elderly, innocent people as they invaded a village. This was standard practice in Vietnam. The only war heroes from that era are my brother and folks like him who deserted, who refused to kill and to be killed in that ugly, poisonous, enterprise. So, yes, what I would like is a truth and reconciliation process. On a stage, let's say at the Hollywood Bowl, comes Kissinger and McNamara and Bush and Cheney, because they were alive at that time, and I'm there, and McCain is there, and Kerry's there, and all of us say what we did, and all of us ask for forgiveness for what we did. And I'm happy to confess what I did, because you know what? In the scale of crimes on that stage, I'm like a lightweight. I mean, I knew shit. I didn't kill anybody.
Right.
I mean, I was an idiot, and so, and that has its own cost. But the point is that there's no reckoning with the kind of distribution of responsibility unless you say out loud, "This is what I did," and you have to face the Vietnamese and say, "This is what I did to your country. We dropped these defoliants. We destroyed your agricultural base. We did that." So that, I think that I don't have any, I would get no joy from putting people in jail. In fact, I should tell you, I suppose we can get to this later, but I am a prison abolitionist. I think we ought to abolish prisons. And whenever I say that to college students, they say, and it's kind of like saying there should be no mayor. College students always say, but what about John Wayne Gacy, who was a famous mass murderer in Illinois? And I say, okay, 1 cell. Now give me another. Okay, Cheney. Okay, now we got 2 cells. But if you start from the premise that every crime deserves a prison cell, then you get 2.5 million people. Right. But if you start from the premise that there are thousands of alternatives and prison is the last alternative, then you get a half a dozen.
Bill, beautiful. Now that was perfect lead into this, because I'm not for laws in general, but we've been raised with laws. I think when you create a law, you create the opportunity to break the law. But this question is, Lewis Hines published photos of child labor in newspaper, printed matter, and the cultural historians want to say that was the tipping point to change a law. Now, me and you, we know that it was more than that there was a zeitgeist. But we're operating on this question on that premise of tipping point to change laws. Upton Sinclair, in your hometown, wrote a book, The Jungle, and it was the tipping point, according to people, to change the meat packaging laws. The question is, can you tell me any music, theater, art, or film that actually was the tipping point to change laws? Like, go back to your poetry guy. Leonard Cohen says, I want a poem that changes laws.
Right, exactly.
But here's the thing. The real question is it still possible to have the same kind of impact of changing laws that printed matter have with these other mediums, music, theater, art, and film? And can you give me a specific example?
I don't know that I can come up with a specific example on the top of my head, but I bet we could if we kicked it around. Because I actually do think that I would add to your list, incidentally, Alex Kotlowitz's book, There Are No Children Here, which began to change the way we thought about public housing and had a huge impact in Chicago. Or I think about Sister Helen Prejean's book, Dead Man Walking, which had a huge impact on how we see the death penalty. Again and again, I think and yet we're going to come up with some examples when we kick it around, because yes, I think what happens is we all are stuck in our own dogma, or we're all stuck in the dogma of common sense. So common sense tells us certain things. It dictates certain ways of thinking. And I give you one from my world of teaching and learning and school change. Every time a politician gets to a microphone and says, we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom, everyone in the audience, including me, nods dully. What am I going to say? My granddaughter deserves that lazy, incompetent teacher? Keep her right there? No, you won the argument. It's the dogma of common sense. Right? And if I got to the microphone first and said every kid in a public school deserves an intellectually grounded, compassionate, morally committed, hardworking, well-rested, well-paid teacher in the classroom, I'd win the argument too. So the question is one of framing. And often what happens is that the reframing takes place with a book or an article or a photograph or, I'm certain, a musical piece or a theater piece. because suddenly we see things differently. In the world that I worry about a lot of about, oppression and exploitation and war and invasion, I think one of the things that we need to see again and again is the face of the marginal, the voice of the one who's outside, because that's what wakes us up to our own humanity. So one great example is my wife, who's a professor of law and does juvenile justice. They put out a book, and I'm blanking on the name of it suddenly, but they put out a book of photographs of people with little one-paragraph interviews of people who had been arrested and done time as juveniles. Senator Alan Simpson, the Republican from Wyoming, this TV star, this athlete, this, suddenly you see the face of the juvenile delinquent, not as some super predator in sneakers who's coming up behind you with a gun, but you see it as somebody who actually recovered from, the worst thing they ever did. And I think again and again, it's showing the human face of the Vietnamese or the Palestinian or the gay person. There's an example. Look, there we came to an example, because the whole notion, when you and I were young, the idea of a gay person was the idea that people would pretty much, the metaphor in their mind was, you're saying it's okay for a man to sleep with a squirrel, and first of all, not to put squirrels down, but that was was kind of the common sense of it. Now, it's not only changed rapidly in our lives, in your life it's changed. So suddenly we saw the President of the United States come out for marriage equality. Of course, he was dragged, as he often is. His big mouth Joe Biden said it first. Then Arnie Duncan said it was a good idea, the Secretary of Education. I was giving a talk to teachers at that time, and I said, we should all immediately gay marry, because the Secretary of Education hates teachers, but he likes gay people. so we could be in business. But the point is, there's 2 points here, really. One is to see the people, to hear the stories, to see the novels that were written, to see the films, the Philadelphia Story and so on, to see these things really, really had an impact in changing the way the whole country saw it. And once it began to accelerate, once the cat was out of the bag, there was no putting the cat back in the bag, right? So now it's just common sense, and it's also a generational thing. Anybody under 60 says, why are we worrying about this? Excuse me. Anybody your age, I mean, it's ridiculous. But the elder, they have to move on. But that's one example, perhaps, where the frame was changed.
Yeah, well, the one I got that I think is really good is Ralph Nader's press conferences as performance art. His book changed the seatbelt laws, but his press conferences was a different art form. So,
well, let's stay on that 1 second more, Jerry, because let's then. I agree with you. Ralph Nader did great performance art. The greatest performance artist of the last century was Martin Luther King.
There you go.
And he almost created an art form which was not only his sermons and his great rhetoric and so on, but it was literally like it almost had to invent this sheriff to stand at the bridge, and it was like he was cast in that role, and you had to invent the guys with the clubs who were going to come at you, and then you created this theater piece, and the theater piece was compelling because, and there's another piece to that which I think is important, which is the ordinary people who the whole country had constructed. I mean, the whole majority culture and media and so on had constructed as not wanting an education, not being interested in voting, just wanting to be simple people doing their simple work. When they stood up and redefined themselves and said, we are not the label you've put on us. We are different than that. We are acting in our own behalf. The thing exploded. There was no going back. I mean, that's what changed that world, was black people in Mississippi themselves standing up and saying, we are not the image that you've created of us. And the art followed, and the art proceeded and followed, and so on. Yeah.
Your line, face of marginal, just evoked in me. Michael Ventura says, look a homeless person in the eyes. Give them a quarter, but look them in the eyes. I mean, that's even more, that they need that more than you giving them a quarter.
I can't tell you how I didn't know that quote, but I have my whole adult life felt that the most important thing, whether I had a quarter or not, was to acknowledge the humanity of the person standing next to me.
Yeah.
And so to say, how are you feeling, brother?
Yeah.
Could you have any money? No, I don't, but I'm going in. Could I get you a coffee?
Yeah.
I'll bring just something that
Yeah.
says you're human.
Yeah.
It's different. And if you look at, for example, Gerry, look at the literature from the Holocaust. One of the things you'll see again and again and again from Elie Wiesel on is this sense of being invisible. You go see a movie like Shoah. The feeling was that we were taken down the city streets to these work camps. We were being worked to death, and people were closing their windows against us. People were pulling the shades. That was the devastation. Of course, being brutalized and worked to death, all that is bad, but it's the sense that you're invisible. You're not seen. My youngest son, is now a public defender in San Francisco, and he's seeing on a daily basis what people who have the privileges we have don't see, which is being poor is not only full-time work, but you're this close to the end of your life. I mean, a flat tire, a fender bender, a bad flu that keeps you out of work for a week. This actually can destroy your life. Now, we will recover from those kinds of things, but a lot of his clients won't. They're like that close to going off the edge. And that's the tragedy. So seeing it, looking a homeless person in the eye, I'm with you on that.
Heavy line. So we're going to switch the tape soon, but I'll go into a little intro to this. The basic question is, Jean-Luc Godard told Michael Moore at Cannes Film Festival, Fahrenheit 9/11 is going to help Bush get elected. Well, it didn't necessarily help Bush get elected, but it galvanized pro-Bushers. So it's called unintended consequences. With this slew of political documentaries over recent years, the bottom line question is, do they more activate or more pacify? Now, I know it's both, but I want to just run out this edge of this tape with the perfect example of you in Weather Underground. What a great film. Every yuppie and their mother could watch The Revolution on PBS, not HBO,
Right.
PBS, and go, right on, brother. Now I don't have to be hit with rubber bullets or whopped over the head.
Right.
I'm for that.
Right.
And you know what? I'm going to tell my friends I'm that's the way I think.
Right.
But then what do you do in the long run? So let me just flip the tape to
Sure.
get that. And do you guys need to pee or anything? Or you?
Nope.
All right. Okay.
He's young. He doesn't have to pee for hours.
Yeah. We should also say on the tape, because I forgot, that Joseph Weidinger is assisting us on the recording. So sometimes you refer to your age, thinking so there are three people involved in this.
Right.
And so that was very good. So you got the question basically.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is, I don't think that we know what changes things. And I think if we knew what changed things, what changed societies, we would do it, but we don't know. And so the longer I live, the more agnostic I am about what brings about social change. The one thing I'm pretty certain about, with just a brief look at history, is that what changes things comes from below. And the idea, for example, I'll give you a couple quick examples. Lyndon Johnson, who passed the most far-reaching civil rights legislation in history, well, maybe since Reconstruction, was not part of the Black Freedom Movement. Franklin Roosevelt was not part of the labor movement, and Abraham Lincoln, in spite of the new movie, was never an abolitionist. But something was happening from below that allowed those three men who were remembered as great presidents to do the right thing when it mattered. One of the problems I think we have, all of us, is that we spend too much time looking at the sites of power that we have no access to and probably never will. We look at the White House, the Congress, the Pentagon, Wall Street, and we look at these things and say, especially after Obama was elected the first time, and the number of students I spoke to who said, I hope he ends the war. I hope he brings about universal health care. I hope he... Right. Well, stop hoping, because that's not who he is or what's happening. When he was asked during the first campaign, who would Martin Luther King support? He said very clearly, King would not support any of us. He'd be in the streets building a movement for justice. That's a hint about what we should be doing.
Yeah.
Because what we can do, all of us, is we have access to our neighbors. We have access to the classroom or the school. We have access to the workplace or the farm. We have access to the community. Those are sites of power that we too often overlook because they're not in, the spotlight. The power that's in the spotlight we don't have access to. Part of why I love Amy Goodman is that she, if you think of the mainstream profit-driven media as embedded with the soldiers or embedded with the ruling class or whatever, Amy's embedded with the community groups. And that's a different, although I remember Studs Terkel and I were speaking together shortly before he died, and he said, I'm deaf. We've known each other for decades, but Studs said, I'm completely deaf. And when they say the press is in bed with the troops, I say, in bed with? What are they doing in bed with? Embedded, he's like, you can't hear. But I think that's an important understanding that it's, that what we need to concentrate on as ordinary people is where we can mobilize our own ordinary power. So you look again at the last 3 years. I mentioned Johnson and Roosevelt and Lincoln, but look at the first term of the Obama administration. He failed to do a lot of things that many progressives would have liked. But what did he do well on? He did well on gay rights, he did well on women, and he did well on the young immigrant activists. Why? Because they didn't shut up. None of them were in the closet begging for recognition. They were in the streets and in his face. So, Dan Savage goes to the White House for some event, and Obama had said, I'm evolving on the gay marriage issue. Savage wore a big button that said, evolve already. And they weren't, the idea that the way you get power to respond is to be nice or to be quiet or to join them, all for the election is a big mistake. Yeah. We have to build our own independent sense of our own capacity to do things and change things. And then we don't look to power and say, please, boss, give us a crumb. We say, this we want. Yeah. Thinking again about Lyndon Johnson, King didn't beg to come to the White House. Johnson begged him to come. And that's a different world.
That's heavy. When you say come from below, could you mean grassroots?
I would say the grassy grassroots is where I see put it this way, the only power we have real access to is the grassy grassroots because that's where we live. We don't have the power of money. We don't have the power of, and yet you see when people are mobilized around an issue, it's very hard for power to ignore that issue when people really are standing up for something. And I feel that way about women, women's rights. They've been, we've seen, again, a huge change in our lifetimes. Gay rights, and now the rights of immigrant youth. These kids are not shutting up, and their courage is absolutely stunning. And they've done, another thing that they've done with that first immigrant rights march about 8 years ago in Chicago, where 1 million people went from the west side past the Haymarket statue, which was, the Haymarket Square was where there was a huge demonstration of immigrants in 1886 that the police fired on. And it created May Day. May Day came from that moment. But they marched past the Haymarket statue to downtown. And the most astonishing thing, talking about seeing visibly the faces of the marginal, is suddenly in the New York Times and on CBS and on NPR, you have guys saying, my name is Juan Cruz. I've been in this country illegally for 20 years. I own an auto repair shop. And you, damn, out of the closet, 11 million people. Out of the closet. And again, once that genie is released, it's hard to put it back.
Dang. Bill, what's more important, conviction or compromise?
I think that without conviction, you are rudderless. But, and I'm not, I haven't thought of it in the abstract. I think it's concrete. Compromise is concrete. So I don't know if you've seen the new movie Lincoln.
Haven't seen it.
Okay, it's the interesting thing about Lincoln is it's Spielberg and Tony Kushner, made a movie with an audience of one in mind, and that one audience was Barack Obama, and the rest of us put down our $10 to support the project. But that movie turns on the question of conviction or compromise. That's what the film is about. Huh. And when Bill Clinton introduced it at the Globe Awards last week, he said he was right on your question. He said what Lincoln showed us is that you must have convictions, but you must be willing to twist some arms and compromise. In terms of the forward motion of history, the people you and I look to, all of us look to, and remember as historical figures, are people who had a very clear moral sense of where they were headed, and they were determined to get there. Doesn't mean they didn't compromise. We all compromise to live our lives. Yeah. I mean, for example, if you and I would just boycott everybody who's a bastard, right, we would be naked sitting on the sand of the beach not eating. You know, I mean, you can't. That's not so. Yeah. So we decide to boycott grapes at a certain point. Right. We didn't boycott Coca-Cola at that moment. Right. We were boycotting grapes. So that's a compromise in a sense. Yeah. But the most important thing to remember is that, and I think young people in particular have to again and again remind themselves that you have to figure out how to live your life in a way that doesn't make a complete mockery of your values. Yeah. That assumes you have values, or you can access or develop values, and then you try to live your life on that course. But does that mean, I can never ride in a car, or I can never do this? Everyone compromises. It's part of life. But without that sense that I have a purpose, that I have a value, take King. The King you learn about in school, then we celebrate and have prayer breakfast for, is an absolutely anemic reflection of the King who was an activist for only 13 years, changed every year, became more radical every year, and by the end was saying things from 1965 on. We need to connect racial justice with economic justice with global justice. We need to fight against racism, militarism, and this kind of consumerist madness that we're caught up in. King said that, 40 years ago, and it's still true. It's those connections and that sense. So when people reduce King to he wanted to integrate the schools, or he had a dream about buses or whatever, that's a reduction. King wanted justice, and he wanted economic justice along with racial justice, along with peace or global justice. Yeah. Great speech. If you read one speech of King's, read the April 4th, 1967 speech. It's online. It's a year to the day of when he was murdered. And it's at Riverside Church. And he says in that speech, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. We have put ourselves on the wrong side of the world revolution. We need a revolution in values in order to have a revolution in fact. And he says this so clearly. When I play it for my students, they think it's Malcolm X because he's so angry. And so, and then you get things like recently in the National Mall, they put a statue of King. And you may not remember this, but 5 years ago, great controversy. All kinds of congressmen and senators thought that the artist had made King look angry. We all know King wasn't angry. Now, that's just the myth making. King was an angry pilgrim. You listen to his sermons. He makes Jeremiah Wright look like a piker. He's saying he 2 months before he dies, he has a sermon called "America is Going to Hell." He was not a happy camper. He wanted justice, and he was slogging towards freedom, but he wasn't doing it in some kind of dream world that we now kind of have constructed around him.
Your philosophy on compromise and conflict, did you get it more from the way your parents raised you, or more on your own?
I think that my parents were hugely important, but they told us things in the 50s that we took seriously. Yeah. They said, for example, all people are equal. And then when they found me getting arrested on that principle, they were shocked. Okay, all people are equal, but please, and this is another. So I think I got a lot from my parents, but I also think, like all human beings, we learn from our experiences. I mean, the funny thing about, I'm now 68 years old, and one of the funny things about getting older is you not only begin to look like your father, but you begin and sound like him, but you realize the pull of the genetic pull is very, very strong. Politically, I couldn't be more different than my father,
Yeah.
and so that's stuff I learned in the kind of cauldron of battle. But I think it's important that I feel very blessed that I was raised in a loving family, that I was accepted, that I was allowed to experiment,
Yeah.
that I was expected to learn from my own experiences, and nobody was driving me to be, a complete reflection of my father. That's happened in spite of myself.
Well put, Bill. Is ambition based more on fear or more on joy?
But there's a lot of different kinds of ambition. I mean, there's professional ambition and material ambition. But I like to think there's also something called intellectual ambition and ethical ambition. And I think the people I admire the most in my close-in life, as well as as I look at history and so on, are people who are driven by an ethical ambition to be a good person,
Yeah.
to want to be a good person. And, one of the things I think is so interesting in our country and in our culture is deep in our DNA, and I think this is in the human DNA as well, is individualism, and you are your own person. But deep within our DNA is also we are part of a community. And the question of how things are framed is often how these get debated politically. So if we're sitting here in your studio and we're saying, don't you think that you have a responsibility for your own health? I mean,
Yeah.
don't smoke, eat right, get some exercise. We would all agree. You have some responsibility for your own health. But if somebody came knocking on our door and said, someone was hit out on the street, should we go help them? We'd thunder out the door. So which is it? Is it individual or is it collective? And the truth is, none of us would be here if it weren't both. If we didn't have a
Yeah.
drive to survive and to be, the ambition to be a human being and to create our humanity and so on, we wouldn't survive. But if we thought we could do it alone, we wouldn't survive. So the people who, in our political debates today, who think that our DNA or our American experience or our
Yeah.
American ideals is all about being an individual on your own, a boat on your own bottom, that's just fantasy.
Yeah.
And I get into these things a lot, Gerry. I have this, I speak a lot on campuses, and since 2008, I'm picketed always wherever I go. And I was speaking at the University of Georgia, and I had a group of Hells Angels come in, all wearing Tea Party Patriot arm patches, and they occupied the front rows. I swallowed hard, but I've been through this with Tea Party folks before. And the first question that the guy asks me, I give my talk, and the head of the Hells Angels group stands at a microphone, and he says, I'm surprised that I agree with you more than I thought I would, but I'm worried that you're a big government guy. And I said, well, I'm worried you're a big government guy. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, for example, how did you all get here? Did you take Interstate 75 to get here? Because if you did, that's a socialist road. That was built by the government, and so you took the socialist road. And then I said, if you're not a big government guy, let's agree that we'll abolish the Pentagon tomorrow, save $1 trillion. And he said, not the Pentagon. I said, exactly. So the idea that some people want to tax and spend and some want to everybody for themselves is nonsense.
Right.
It's all a question of who do you want to tax and what do you want to spend on.
Yeah.
I want to tax the rich and spend on education, health care, and guaranteed rights of income. You want to tax somebody else and spend on surveillance, military, and police. We disagree, but that's an honest disagreement. That's not like I'm the big government guy. Nothing's bigger than the Pentagon. So those are kind of things that I think that we need to be clearer about, framing properly.
Framing,
yeah.
This is it. Is loyalty based on reason?
Sometimes, your loyalty to your children, it's innate, but it's also the reasonableness of it is that nobody could survive if we didn't have those kinds of loyalties. But then as I say that, I'm immediately thinking, but it's very innate. I mean, I would walk through fire for my kids then and now.
Yeah.
When they were born, you have this little piece of protoplasm in front of you. You can't quite understand why you're feeling the feelings you're feeling. But the funny thing is, 25 years later, when my oldest son had an accident, he could have been 18 months old for the way I reacted. You know, I mean, I wanted to save him. I wanted to trade places with him. I wanted to, you know. So I think that that's pretty innate. It's pretty human. And I think we can see all kinds of acts of courage in human beings that are not rational, but they are loyalty of a certain type, and they're innate to some extent.
Bill, is perception reality?
I'd put it this way. You know, there is a real world, but it's not the same for all.
Yeah.
And so my wife and I've been married for 42 years, and we go to the movies together. And typically, my birthday wish this last holiday season was that she would go to a movie of my choosing, which is very hard, but she did it. But we go to the movies together now and then, and I see everything. She's very selective. She has very high standards, like no violence or racism, and I'm like, damn. You know. So, but I did go with her to see, for example, Avatar. And I came out sobbing like a baby. I sobbed all through it. Yeah. And she came out and said, that was a romanticized piece of shit. And so we saw the same thing. Yeah. Our brain pan was invaded by the same sensations, but it meant differently. And I said to her, but I want to live on the blue planet. And she said, get over yourself. But, you know, it's like, so yes, there is a real world. There is an objective world. But the idea that that world can be grasped or understand beyond or outside of interpretation is not true. So we see the same set of facts, we see the same reality, and it means differently to different people. And that's part of what I keep referring to as framing. Yeah. Part of it is we have to find some common frames in order to move forward. And I'm convinced, I mean, I often say to students when I'm speaking to student groups, you know, are you all against slavery? And they all say, of course. Well, we're all against slavery, of course. Good for us. We're a bunch of radicals. Except if you were against slavery in 1848 in the United States, you would have been quiet about it at the very least, because you would have been against the founders, the first 8 presidents of the United States, the Bible, your preacher, your parents, your partner. I mean, maybe you would have been, but think about it, because, and then I often say to them, and you're all for a woman's right to vote. Oh, yes. And even you men. Yes, yes. But 100 years ago, you would have been against the Bible, your preacher, the law, the founders, etc. So the question is, the point isn't to shame us about the past. The point is to say, what are we not seeing now as we are enmeshed in the kind of dogma of common sense, the logic of the times? What are we missing? So, for example, 2.5 million of our fellow citizens are in prison, mass incarceration at an unthinkable scale. Even for us, go back 30 years, there were 500,000 people in prison. Now there's 2 million more than that in prison. What happened? And how did we come to think that's common sense? You remember a time when seeing homeless people was rare. Yeah. Seeing a homeless child, never. I remember the first homeless child I saw. And that was impossible. It was mind-blowing. Now we see people are homeless. Yeah. What are you going to do? You know, and we shrug. So mass incarceration is not a natural act. Yeah. Homelessness is not a natural act. Yeah. Why has it been naturalized? And that's where I think we have to say, no, I will object and step outside of the frame of common sense. I'll look at it as a European or as an African, or, you know, I'll ask myself, how else could it be? Yeah. And I think without that, that's where we get to art and poetry and music and so on. Without the ability to expand your imaginative horizon, to think of the world as if it could be otherwise, standing next to the world as such, is a world that could be or should be. And if you can't think of that world, then you're stuck. Yeah. Then you're stuck in the sewer that we exist in. But if you can say, right next to this world is a possible world, then you have some space to move.
Well put. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness?
Gosh, I've never thought of that. Brain, the human brain, probably a bit of both. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we detect consciousness in the sense that I can almost feel myself even now reaching out to
Yeah.
try to, my brain is reaching
Yeah.
toward you guys.
Yeah.
But I also think that um, the marvel of the human brain is that we can think that our imaginations can take us places that.
Yeah.
But I want to qualify that because without the imagination, without the visual arts and the fine arts and all the rest of it, we would be stuck in a very gray world. So
Yeah.
the great thing about art is it expands the capacity to see the world as if it could be otherwise. So the great Chicago poet Gwendolyn Brooks, who was my neighbor until she died in 2000, Brooks said, in a poem called The Dedication to the Picasso, which was a statue in downtown Chicago, is a statue, and she begins it by saying, "Does man love art?" And her response is, "Man visits art but cringes. Art hurts. Art urges voyages." So that's my mantra about art. I think that the notion that art urges voyages, you're going on this path, but look at this possible world. And I look at Cloud Atlas, or I look at a lot of things, and I say, wow, there's another way of seeing all this that's quite different.
Yeah.
I want to qualify it in one way, which is the imagination. We should not color the. I'm speaking of the imagination beyond making kind of circles in the sky, but I also think there's another danger, which is the human imagination is also capable of imagining Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. You and I couldn't imagine Auschwitz, but somebody did, and then it was. I mean, and so the imagination is not always a benign thing or a beneficent thing, and that's why my teacher Maxine Green would always say, let's think in terms of the social imagination. What can we imagine together? How can we imagine a world that we live in together that would be a better world, a finer world, a more balanced world, a more peaceful, a more just world? And I think there are certain kinds of philosophical experiments that are worth doing. I said a minute ago, that young people should make a pledge to live their lives so as not to make a mockery of their values. But I often use the Rawls experiment with students, which is, imagine yourself in utero. You're about to be born, and you're going to be born into a society, and you don't know anything about the society, and you don't know who you'll be born in the society. What would be the characteristics of that society that you would want, knowing that you're about to be born into it? So the first thing we would say is we don't want there to be any slavery, right? Because I might be born a slave.
Yeah.
You don't know where you're going to be. So you begin to construct a society that's one that whatever position you're born into, what if you're born blind and without the use of your limbs? Yeah. What society do you want to be born into? And I think that's a really good experiment. Good
that's
to think about.
Experiment.
Yeah, very important.
Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Can you tell us a weakness that you've actually incorporated to become a strength?
I think that's a great. I mean, I had never heard that, but I think it's a wonderful way to think about it because I often think, and I'll get to your question, but I often think that every one of us, every human being that we know, and especially close in, our strengths and our weaknesses are the same. It's just in one context they come out as weaknesses, and in another. So I have this adopted son who's now a lawyer, a public defender. When one of his qualities, and he lost his parents when he was 14 months old, and came to live with us. And one quality that he has is a kind of stick-to-itiveness. But when he was dysfunctional, you would have said he's obsessive compulsive.
Right.
Now you would say he's focused. And which is it? He's the same kid.
Right.
And he's doing the same kind of thing. But as a public defender, his focus makes him a very effective, advocate on
Yeah.
on behalf of the
Yeah.
marginal and the exploited. In my own case, I think that being wordy, being someone who loves words and loves to think in terms of verbal kinds of things, means that in one context I talk too much, and in one context I just go on and on. Bernadine says, my wife says, there you go, you've kind of on a Bill Charm alert. Be careful, So that can be really dysfunctional in certain collective contexts. It can be,
Yeah.
this is a guy who's talking too much. But in other contexts, it can be a good thing to be able to have the words that are necessary for the moment when we're about to jump into conflict with the police. For example. So it could be either or.
Very good. Yeah. The problem with that question is, and I'm always trying to refine it, is as soon as you say the word weakness, it implies
Right.
a negative.
Right.
And McLuhan learned from Bucky Fuller and these folks that breakdowns can be breakthroughs.
Absolutely.
So again, breakdown implies a negativeness,
Yeah.
or something that's not working. It's
Well, even take it. Let's go again back to schools and childhood. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that early childhood educators always talk about, that two things really that are relevant to this. One is we talk about the teachable moment. The teachable moment is not a moment when everything is coming together. It's a moment when everything's falling apart. So you're in an early childhood classroom, and one kid grabs another kid's bagel, and the other kid pushes him and bites him. That's a teachable moment. It's chaos, it's confusion, it's violence, but it's also the moment when we can learn about how to live together better. And the same is true with regression in child development. People often talk about regression. I'm regressing, I'm going backwards. They talk about it as a negative thing, but actually it's an enormously positive thing.
Right.
When you're 12 or 13 and suddenly your body is changing and you're broadening your base of affiliation, and suddenly you start to wet your bed, or you start to want to be cuddled by your dad, or whatever. This is because you're gathering strength to move forward. Adolescent depression is a classic of regressing because the world is terrifying, but you gather your strength to take the step forward. So it's negative, but it's not negative. It's a positive.
Very good. The American Indians and Eastern culture respect their elders. Can you explain Western culture's disdain for old age?
I don't know if I can explain it, but I note it, I see it. And one of the bizarre things about being 68 and retired is, like every other category, if you're single, if you're married, the culture brings in a whole set of meanings. One of the reasons my middle son resisted getting married, even though he was committed and had a child and so on, was he said, I don't want everybody treating us like it's a habit. I'm committed, but I want that commitment to be not acknowledged by the state or the culture. So being retired, it's almost like if I say, well, I'm retired, I can feel people both wanting to open the door and kind of direct me towards the grave. In other words, the assumption, when you use the word retired, the assumption is you have no ambition.
Right.
You have no sex drive.
Right.
You have no, the things that you took for granted before you retired, right, are gone. And it's not true. So I think that part of what has kept America is this sense of constant reinvention, a strength and a weakness, the sense that we're always new. And so, and the problem with that, going back to say Vietnam, is that we never stop to take a reflective look at ourselves and say, what did we do wrong? What would we not want to do again? And that leads to, in the Vietnam case, it leads to aggression in Iraq and aggression in Afghanistan and Panama and all the rest of it, because we don't learn the lessons. Everything is new. It starts today. I remember, I'm not a believer in that there ever was such a thing called the 60s. That's all marketing. I don't remember in late 1969 looking at the calendar and saying, oh shit, it's about to end.
Right.
I've got to get laid immediately. I remember that. But I think so. Nobody lives by decades, right? But at the same time, there is a sense that the new left, which we were a part
Yeah.
of, not the old left, bad,
Yeah.
bad. We're the new left, and then the new left, and then
Yeah.
it's always about now, never about the past. When I wrote this book, Fugitive Days, I write about history, and I write about my mother always saying, let's not dwell on the bad things. Let's
Right.
just remember the good things.
Right.
And that's that sense of reinvention. So we are youth oriented, now oriented, today, never tomorrow, and certainly never yesterday.
Yeah.
Everything good is young and sexy and terrific. And that is a deep problem in our culture.
Right.
I also think it's linked to capitalism and marketing and all the rest of it. I mean, I think the exploitation as capitalism is kind of in its death throes, as it's kind of done its major work both for good and for bad. I think that capitalism is looking at the last possible places where you can drain some profit. So they're selling the air, they're selling the water, they're selling the dirt, and they're selling the pensions, and they're exploiting young people. And the youth market is such a horrible way to think about young people. We say the youth market, but then that's true of our whole society. There's the housing market and the food industry.
Yeah.
And what about housing? What about food? It's the food industry, right? So I worry about all this stuff.
McClone said the word makes the market.
Exactly.
That's why he said study advertising.
Exactly.
And so, how do you find peace of mind?
For me, and this is a genetic flaw that I was born with. My mother was a complete Pollyanna, and I like to think that I can see the dark side of things. But at the end of the day, I have this genetic pull that my mother gave me, which is I feel all right. I'm glad to be alive, and I'm glad to be putting one foot in front of the other. I'll tell you a funny thing that I was just thinking of the other day. When my wife, I had 3 little kids, and my wife went to federal lockup for an indeterminate amount of time, and it was a very rough time for me. And I began doing cocaine and just to stay awake. And at a job, I had 3 little kids to take care of. My wife was in prison. I tried to see her several times a week. It was hard. And she'd been in for about a month, and I went to an old friend of ours who was in her 80s then, a very, very wonderful, progressive New York psychiatrist. And we sat down for 2 hours in her office, and I told her my story and why I was suffering. And at the end of it, she took my hands and she said, Bill, you're not depressed, you're sad, and you've never had that experience. So your job, she said, depression is, she said, is an entirely different thing. And she said, you don't need a therapist. You need to work to get your wife out of jail. Just change your circumstances and you'll be better. And it was very profound, but so I have this kind of, I consider it both a weakness and a strength. I kind of, sometimes it's a weakness. Somebody will tell me their problems, and I'll say, well, there are 2 things you can do. There's nothing I can do, So that's the weakness part. But the strength is, and there's a politics to it too, Gerry.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm not an optimist because I don't pretend to know what's next down the road. But I'm not a pessimist either because they also pretend to know what's next. What I am is a person who believes deeply that we should all live with 1 foot in the mud and muck of the world as it is, and 1 foot reaching for a world that could be. That is to say, we see ourselves as works in progress. We see ourselves as contingent. We see ourselves as in motion in a living history. And that means to me that I choose to have a politics of possibility, a politics of confidence. I want to get up every morning and say, today I'm going to overthrow capitalism, and then go to bed every night saying, shit, not today, but still there's things we can do. There's something we can do. Yeah. And that's what I want to, I want to live on that edge. I want to live with that kind of arcing forward. That's to me the only sensible thing. And it's just to repeat, I think both optimists and pessimists get it wrong because they pretend to be able to look into the future, and nobody can.
funny thing, they asked McLuhan, are you an optimist or a pessimist? He goes, I'm an apocalypse. We're fucked. But the key thing there is, because he was so into etymology, the word apocalypse means to reveal.
Yeah, exactly.
So he was just Toto saying, he had the best line. He says, I ain't starting the fire, I'm just turning the alarm on. We should pay attention.
Who said this?
McLuhan.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, I think that's right. And I think the people who turn the alarm on are often, prophets out of place. They're often considered idiots or brilliant but irrelevant. And I actually think, again, go back, 50 years and beyond, everyone we look to is somebody who had that kind of sense of turning on the alarm, of pointing to the future, of being powered by ideals. So we revere, Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day and Jane Addams and Du Bois and Debs and on back, John Brown and Harriet Tubman. Well, these were people who were not loved in their own lifetime. In fact, it's hard for folks to know, especially younger folks, that Martin Luther King, on the day he died, his ratings of popularity in the kind of polls that were done then were less than George W. Bush's when he left office. So now we all know that King's a saint and we love him, but we didn't know it when he was living and coming to Chicago. Read the Chicago Tribune editorials about King when he came to do open housing. And my father, incidentally, was the main negotiator between the city and King. And I was in the marches. So it was Bernardine was a lawyer for the marchers. But every night on the news, there'd be my dad, because he was this public citizen, right? This ruling class guy. But the editorials in the Tribune said, we don't need no Martin Luther King here in Chicago. We know how to deal with race in Chicago. He should go back to the South where he belongs. Yeah. Now today we want to cover that editorial up. So, we all love Martin Luther King. You didn't love him when he was alive, actually. And I think it was Chris Rock or somebody said, when they name a street after you, watch out. Malcolm X College, Martin Luther King Boulevard. And Chris Rock goes on, Martin Luther King Boulevard, that's the scariest part of town. Don't go there. Right? Anyway,
that was beautiful. Stuff. Bill, thank you so much. You create what you resist. That's something someone said, and I'd love to get your opinion of that. Actually, Bob Goldthwait took it one step further. You are what you hate. And James Joyce says, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. And, of course, Louis Buñuel really firmed it all up. He says, thank God I'm an atheist. So this whole thing, you are what you hate, or you create what you resist. Any kind.
Yeah, I mean, just, I one of the things I love about the kinds of crazy questions you're asking is that they really are, they point to the dialectic and they point to the contradiction, that we would like to think that things are one way or the other.
Yeah.
So you are what you resist. Absolutely. I love the comment, I'm an atheist, thank God. I mean, I am obsessed with the American government. I think about it all the time. And
but would you run for president?
Never. And the reason I wouldn't, I mean, I two things to say about running for president, actually. One is I'd be a damn good president.
Right. Bill, I'd vote for you.
And I think you would be too, and I think you would be too. And I think that when somebody says, your brother-in-law and your sister are in Detroit, and they're part of, a great political movement there. But Jimmy Boggs, one of the first times I saw Jimmy Boggs, he's an African-American labor working-class guy who really was my epitome of an organic intellectual. He was a guy who came from the South, worked in the auto plants, and was a genius. I mean, he wrote unbelievably brilliant political analysis. The first time I saw Jimmy was I was a student in Ann Arbor. So I'm a young white kid from a wealthy family in Chicago. I'm in Ann Arbor, and Jimmy's giving a talk. And there was a kind of a black nationalist conference going on. And he said two things I'll never forget. One is, all these people had been extolling the virtues of ancient Africa. And Jimmy gets up and says, I don't know about you, but to me a king has always been a son of a bitch. So, so all these guys, the great black kings in our history, aren't we great? He said, no, a king has always been a son of a bitch. But the other thing he said to these, kids at Michigan is he said, I could be president of the United States and I'd be a damn good president. And they're all kind of, really? I mean, he's got this Southern accent. He's clearly a working class black guy. And he went on to say, if you don't believe that you could be president of the United States, then you don't believe that you're the sovereign, because you don't think that you're as good as some political class that has self-created itself. That's bullshit. That's why I say this thing about the mayor. I don't buy the idea that there's a political class. The ruling class, economically, financially, is so corrupted and so backward that it's hard to believe. But the political class has no answers either. And we can watch their death dance going on right now, but they have no answers. So the question, could we? Yes, we could. I could be president, but since I don't really believe that that's where change comes from, I want to kind of purge myself of the kind of obsession with the thing that I don't want to be.
Good.
Right? So you're raising it in such an interesting way, because it's true, but it also gives us a hint about what we should kind of meditate on and take a walk around the block and think about, because I don't want to get trapped in that thing. But again, our imaginations provide the limits of our horizons of what we think is possible. And so what does it take to be an activist or a person who thinks about change? I think it sometimes takes a certain, locked inness. It takes a certain kind of feeling that the oppression is too much. Sometimes it takes a sense of possibility that comes from the arts and so on. But what I really want to be is somebody who's willing to take risks on behalf of the future, and that's a hard thing.
Yeah. Wyndham Lewis has a great line. He says, artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future.
I love it.
So it's like, be here
I love
now.
it. I love
Live
it. Yeah,
here now.
Absolutely. And I think that there's all kinds of things that anesthetize us.
Yeah.
When privilege is a very clear anesthetizer. So when I first was teaching at the University of Illinois, big urban campus, and I noticed after about 2 months that the women, when class ended at 8 p.m., the women grouped together. The men just ran out to the train in their cars.
Yeah.
Why were they grouping together?
Yeah.
Why couldn't I see it? And what I couldn't see, and none of the men apparently could see, was that it's not a safe place to be a woman at 8 o'clock at night.
Oh, yeah.
My privilege anesthetized me, you see. So then I had to kind of wake up and ask them, is this what's happening? Of course. What do you think? Dopey? I mean, they were nicer than that. But then we made a plan to have a different exit strategy. But we couldn't have made the plan if our anesthesia hadn't worn off somehow. But being Americans and just going day in and day out, ignoring the $1 trillion military budget, day in and day out, ignoring the torture chambers, ignoring the mass incarceration, we can do it because we're privileged. And privilege puts us to sleep. There are other things that put us to sleep too, but privilege is a big one for me to think about.
If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
I'd say be smarter, be stronger, I'd say good luck, but try to be smarter and try to do the dialectic I talked about earlier. Try to live in a way that you are opening your eyes every day anew. Try to live in a way that you act on whatever the known demands, but then be sure to doubt that what you did was all that. And without the doubt, you fail to. But I want to do all that. I want to open my eyes. I want to act, and I want to doubt. Well, maybe I should add a fourth. I want to open my eyes and be astonished. I want to be astonished at the beauty and joy and ecstasy all around me. I think I do a good job of that, but I also want to be astonished at the unnecessary suffering, the undeserved pain, the crap we visit on one another for reasons that are mysterious or degrading. And then I want to act, and then I want to doubt.
We got 2 minutes. In briefly, if you can, what's the difference between rights and responsibilities, and what's the difference between rebellion and revolution? It's huge, but
they're both big.
I
think rights and responsibilities are flip sides of the same coin. I think that we get our rights when we demand them, but the right to be free, the right to stand up as a black person in Mississippi, also involves the responsibility to be a new kind of person to deserve that. I feel like in revolution, I want to be a different person because in the current state, I'm not worthy of the changes I'm imagining. So
Yeah.
rebellion and revolution, I think they are sisters and brothers. I
Yeah.
think that rebellion, in my definition, I guess would be shorter term, but I think we need rebellion in our own consciousness, in our own lives, in our own personal relations. And I think we also need revolution, but I'll go back to King, a revolution in values in order to have a revolution in fact. We can't have a revolution in fact unless we come to believe, for example, that we are all worthy of life. And a decent society would say the essentials of life, food, medicine, clothing, housing, these are things that every human being deserves by dint of being born. So when Mitt Romney says, they think they should have food. Hell yes, we think we should have food. We're people, And I want to say, yes, a basic human society gives human beings the basis of life.
Yeah. Bill, you're my hero. Thank you.
You're my hero.
You
so
are.
we're
That
even.
was so
Thank you.
good, man.
Thank you very much.
God, I hope we
Thank
can
you
spend
for
more
having
time
me.
in the